Hey everybody, this is Vina 007 and I am joined today by Varley.
Hey, Matt on the forums. Varley on the forums? What?
Do you know who you are, Matt?
No idea.
And after a long time by It Rhymes with Sleek.
Howdy, I'm Jack. It rhymes with sleek on the forums.
How long has it been since you've vocked, dude?
Ooh, probably like 2 years. When did the Revenant come?
Jesus, is it that long?
Pretty much.
Okay, well, it's good to have you back. The topic for discussion today is a Vollop. For those of you who don't know, this is a format that we have shamelessly stolen from the Dollop, which is a really awesome history comedy podcast that you all should check out, where each week they take, or every other week, they take a topic. One of the hosts talks about the story to the other host who has no idea what it is. It's really funny. You should definitely check out the Dollop with a D. This, however, is the Vollop with a V. So,
I will have to say, though, it is typically very funny. The recent episodes are almost infuriating.
Why? What have they been covering? I've got a whole backlog. I haven't listened.
Oh, God. What have they been covering? John McCain. They covered Wells Fargo. Nuri people, Nuri Island by Australia. You know, just capitalism run amok and elitism and all the good stuff that we're just left, holding the bill for.
Oh, Christ alive. So basically it's as depressing as real life.
Yeah, it's not that kind of like, people were so stupid in the past. Like, good thing we're way beyond that. We're not. We're still just as dumb.
We are just
anyway, usually it is very funny.
But on the positive side, we still have a government, so that's good. It wasn't clear this morning when I woke up that would be the case by this point in the afternoon, but that's happy days. Okay, so October 1938, Moscow.
Ooh.
So this is not, I have to apologize because I think FT Ward thinks this is going to be a podcast about the Cambridge spies. It's not.
Cambridge Spies is a completely different group, right?
Yeah, October 1938,
that was in the 50s, right?
Moscow. Born in Stalin's Russia, Oleg Gordievsky is going to be the subject of this follow-up. So I hope you guys are still interested. He is a Russian. He's born in the time of Stalin's purges, so it's a really kind of sinister, paranoid, fucking disgusting time in Russian history. And his father is a KGB officer who was involved in the Sovietization of Kazakhstan and mass famine. So a very kind of probably guilt-ridden, tight-lipped guy who doesn't really talk about it in the house. He is what Oleg will later come to call Homo Sovieticus, a man who thinks the party is God. And they are the elite. They're living in Moscow in an apartment. So this is elite life in Moscow in the 1930s. There is an apartment. You have one family to each bedroom and a shared kitchen and bathroom between three families. So living high.
Wait a minute, one bathroom?
Yeah.
College housing.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, but college housing is like one person per bedroom sharing that bathroom. This is a whole family in one bedroom and then multiple bedrooms of whole families sharing one bathroom, right?
So I guess, like, the only good part is, like, you don't have to worry about, like, one family having taco night or something if you're all just eating porridge.
I'm sure they had a lot of taco night in Soviet Union, 1938.
Yeah. It's like, what's for dinner tonight? Boiled potatoes again. Great.
Oh, I love that board.
Yeah.
With a side order of cabbage.
A beets soup?
Anyway. Oh, goodness. So anyway, they're living in this like deeply, deeply paranoid time, but they have the perception that they're doing okay. And Oleg is like really super smart. He's a long distance runner, which will come in handy later. His big brother, who he thinks is really glamorous, also joins the KGB and becomes kind of like... The KGB has two types of spies. It has the legal ones who go into a country under sort of diplomatic cover and pretend to be working in an embassy. And then it has the completely illegal ones who are doing sort of like nefarious shit underground.
Yeah. So, do you think he was a long-distance runner by choice or necessity? Like, his job was, like, just really far away and he had to make it to work on time?
Hell, commute.
Oh, okay. He also excels in languages, so he speaks Russian. He learns German in school. And in 1955, age 17, this is in the midst of the Khrushchev thaw, when it was all like de-Stalinization, he decides to join the Moscow State Institute of Foreign Relations, which apparently is like the Russian Harvard. It's sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so I don't really understand that. That's like a government department just like runs Harvard. Weird. 17-year-old Oleg Gordievsky is learning Swedish at the Moscow State Institute of Foreign Relations, and he meets someone who's going to become a good friend of his called Standa Kaplan, who's a Czech guy, because people from all over, obviously the Soviet bloc, are coming to study there. And this guy is also, or maybe not also, because I think at this point Oleg is still like Homo Sovieticus, but Standa's already a little bit skeptical about Soviet Union politics, and he's hoping that the Khrushchev thaw is going to usher in this period of reform. But at this point, I think Oleg is pretty much on board with everything. So the next year, 1956, he's 18 years old, and that is the year of the Hungarian Uprising, which was basically a pro-reform kind of nationalist movement in one of the Soviet bloc countries, and it was brutally crushed. I mean, Soviet Union sent in tanks and basically just absolutely wiped out the reform movement. But at this point, Oleg's still in the Soviet Union, so the news filters through, but, there's very heavy propaganda. So he's kind of maybe suspecting that the reforms are not going to go through, but maybe is still a believer. So the big turning point, or one of the big turning points, happens a couple years later. It's now August 1961. He's 23. He gets his first foreign posting to East Berlin. And at this point, although Berlin is split between the Soviet and the Western zones, you can kind of not walk freely, but you can get from one side to the other. And apparently, I didn't realize this, 20% of the population of East Berlin had gone west. They'd fled Soviet rule.
Hold on, what year is it?
1961.
And he is?
23.
Okay, so 38. Okay. I was like, wait a minute. I thought... Anyway. So that's a lot of people that fled to the west.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the first time he's seeing evidence that when people have a choice, obviously they are fleeing for something better. And basically he's in Berlin. The KGB is using him to pass docs to his brother Vassally, who's a sleeper agent in East Germany. But he's there to do some kind of vague internship. And he's there literally when the Soviets put up the Berlin Wall, seemingly overnight. And he's seeing the barbed wire go up. He's seeing people trying to flee, like jumping into canals to try and get to the other side. And the Berliners being shot in the back by Soviet troops. So this is like a major, not turning point.
So it's almost like people would want to leave a shitty life, that they'd even go so far as to climb whatever wall is in front of them, dividing them from a shitty life to the possibility of a better life. And that no wall could actually contain them unless they're just shot down mid.
Yeah, but
crossing.
I mean, can you imagine if you've lived effectively inside the Soviet Union, so you've never realized there's an alternative, and all you've had is propaganda about how life here is better than in the West, and then you just get this incredibly visceral demonstration of how people will do anything to escape, and how actually the country you thought was okay is just a brutal prison camp and shooting people in the back. I mean, that's pretty hardcore.
Isn't that one of the anecdotes between like America and Russia, where Russia's like, whatever, we crank out like 1 million televisions a year, and America's like, well, turn them on.
Yeah.
It's just the information of like, this is not how the world is, like your drab society, like being overlooked by your government all the time. Like there's something better out there.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me how much of that is still around in the world. I mean, clearly you think of North Korea, but I even had a friend my best friend in college, who was from China. And, he just kind of thought all the political stuff happening over there was business as usual until he came to America. And even then, he just thought our politics was like a circus. But he went and listened to a podcast about every president and came back and went, holy crap, my country's messed up.
You know what's funny is like you can get indoctrinated, but you can also still have a kind of secular mind of your own government and just see our government as like weak-willed or whatever, and like take pride in the fact that your government gets shit done because when they say build a road here, it gets built. So I think there's like a different, there's obviously very operationally, there's a big difference between the governments, but, certain people can look at it certain ways and, kind of either say, yeah, my government's really fucked up, or, hey, no, you guys are kind of fucked up.
But how would you know, right? Like, how would you know that in the West people have an apartment all to themselves?
Yeah.
You watch like reruns of Friends that are just getting over to your country, and they're like, people in Russia have the Rachel haircut now. It's just nice.
Anyhow, so he has this like shocking experience in Berlin, but he still stays with the KGB because it just feels like it's the elite group in the country, and it's a way for him to see more. If he wants to go abroad and see more of the world, then pretty much the only way he can do that is to become a KGB agent. So he goes back to Moscow, and they put him in spy school. Guess what the school is called? School 101. No Orwellian irony there. And one of the people who lectures him is Kim Philby.
Is who?
Kim Philby.
The Oxford Five, right?
Yeah, one of the Cambridge spies. Not Oxford, dude.
Five.
Not Oxford. We are not traitors.
They're all boy bands to me.
It's the other guys. But, so this is FT Ward, this one's for you. There is a feature of a Cambridge spy. And one of the things that Kim Philby teaches him, or all of the spies, is if you're ever caught, never confess. Always try and brazen it out, which... as we will see, is advice that Oleg takes to heart. So anyway, he kind of goes to school. He finishes in 1963. He's now 25. And he thinks he's going to be posted abroad, which is why he's kind of like perfect German and Swedish. But they give him a desk job where he has to translate documents, and he's really bored.
Oh, fucking bummer.
I know, right? And he's literally working at the head of the KGB, like their main building in Moscow, which is kind of cool. But yeah, boring AF. So he decides that the way to kind of get his career going is to get married, because apparently in those days, everyone in the KGB, like it was this very kind of prudish, conservative organization. Like you could not drink on the premises. If you were found having an affair, that would like set your career back. So he just needs Yeah, no, totally, because they're all drinking like mad after work. But in the office, it's just incredibly conservative. So he needs to find a wife. And he, not really being in love, he marries a woman called Yelena, who is a feminist. And she also wants to get out of the country. So it's kind of like not necessarily a marriage of convenience, but it's kind of like a delusion à deux. Like they both realize that it's partly attraction, but it's partly just to get ahead.
What does Soviet feminism look like?
I think Soviet feminism looks like pretty much any other feminism, right? Like she did not expect, if they were both working full-time jobs, that she would have to come home and automatically be the one to like make dinner and clean the dishes. And it's really funny because when you read his autobiography, and this guy is like a real hero. Like I would go so far as to say Oleg Gordievsky is probably one of the most influential and heroic spies that's ever lived. He's still like a shitty misogynist. It's like, this marriage was never destined to, she just wouldn't cook proper food for me every night, and she would disagree with me, and she would whine and bitch, and I wanted to have children, and she didn't want to have children, and like that's just appalling.
So he was married. Yeah, I get it.
This is a scary insight into the Varley household right now.
Hey, at least I can boil potatoes. I know how to do that much.
Yeah, good. Okay, but anyway, the ruse works because at the age of 28, finally he is posted, this is 1966, to Copenhagen in Denmark. And it's really touching when you read his reactions to landing in Copenhagen. He calls it the equivalent of going from a world in grey to a world in colour. He says it's a cultural awakening. He couldn't believe that he's really into classical music and he could just listen to Sibelius or Mozart or Bach rather than this boring Soviet positivistic music. And he would go to the library and just get bags, like carrier bags full of books. He couldn't believe he was just allowed to read everything, and he's just reading as much as he possibly can. So he's one of us, right? He's a vocker. He's a kind of nerd, a book nerd.
Yeah. It's really weird because I read about this, and it's depicted in a few books and movies about the Cuban Revolution and how a lot of the homosexual and artistic and intellectualistas really thought that this would be a moment of great freedom, and they can explore themselves openly, and and then all of a sudden it gets shaped and molded and supported by the Soviets that impose their certain kind of will onto Cuba and that structure, and obviously all the intellectuals and real communists and any homosexuals and everything were all kind of jailed and disappeared.
Well, funny you should say that, Varley.
Oh.
One of the things that Yelena and Oleg buy when they're in Denmark is gay porn. They buy a gay porn magazine because they're just curious. They just didn't know what gay people did. So they just sit there as a married couple in the house and start flicking through this gay porn magazine.
You think they're looking for hooves or whatever their government told them were?
And it's even better because obviously, as members of the Soviet embassy, they're under surveillance by Danish Secret Service. So the Danish people find this gay porn magazine in their trash, think that Oleg is probably secretly gay, and they set up a gay honey trap for him, which obviously he doesn't fall for because he's not gay.
He's just curious.
So this goes on his record, on the notes that, can be tempted potentially with a gay honey trap. But yeah. Anyway, so...
Was Elena gay, do you think?
No. Okay, they just don't get on. I mean, at this point, their marriage is basically over, but the problem is they both know that if they divorce each other, that is going to set back both of their careers. And at this period, he learns Danish. So he's in Denmark and really I think we have to think of his rebellion and his treachery as basically a cultural thing as much as a political one. I mean, he hates the Soviet Union and wants to betray it, but it's as much because he sees it's not about political freedom, it's about that, but it's also about cultural freedom, which I think is kind of unusual.
So he's more like I love the Soviet Union. Why are they denying people this art and music and stuff like that? Or are they just
he just wants to.
You can love your country and hate your government. It's possible.
Exactly. I think he's also a bit of an Anglophile. But anyway, so he's still in Denmark. We get to 1968, so at this point he's 30. At the 20th of August is the Prague Spring. So you have this reform movement taking place in Prague, Czech Republic, a bit similar to the Hungarian Uprising. And once again, the Soviets and send in Warsaw Pact troops and just brutally put it down. They send in 2,000 tanks, 200,000 troops. If any of you listening have been to Prague, you'll realize what a disproportionately large amount of people and material that is. It's not a big city. And actually, although Oleg didn't know this, his brother Vasily had been sent as an underground spy into Prague to sort of undermine the reform efforts. So this is kind of fascinating, right? Because unlike the Hungarian Uprising, when Oleg is hearing of this, he's in Denmark, so he has free newspapers. He can read truly about what's going on and how brutal it is. And it's a real turning point. He is so angry at what his government has done that he assumes that his apartment is bugged and that his phones are bugged. So in his apartment, he starts angrily lashing out, telling his wife that he's really pissed off with the Soviet government. And he assumes and hopes that the Danish Secret Service will listen to this and approach him to become a spy. Yeah, but sadly nothing happens because it's like even intelligence gathering today. You gather so much intelligence, you don't get through it. So he feels he's kind of reached out and nothing happened. His best friend from university that I mentioned before, Standa Kaplan, who was Czech, is in Prague at this time, and he begins gathering secrets. He hasn't become a spy yet, but he's gathering material that he'll eventually be able to use to defect. So I think for me, the Prague Spring is really the 100% turning point where both Oleg and Standa realize that they're going to have to get out.
So I've two things to say here. So I was listening to NPR and they're talking about how the Eastern European countries are so adept at kind of tooling out Russian propaganda, especially as it's now concerned with social media and stuff, because they've been doing it trying to do it forever, ever since the Berlin Wall fell, and they've just been under the Soviet influence. So they actually have a television program that's how Russia lied to us this week or something. And the guy that I was talking about, it's like they take it seriously, so they want to inform their populace. So at the time that we're watching like America's Got Talent or The Voice or some bullshit reality thing, like they're being told like what propaganda they're being fed by Russia to influence, whatever. And we're just like, whatever, like, we'll look at our social media and just, believe everything.
We'll get there too. I think once you start getting lied to, at some point you start kicking back, right? So anyway,
and then the other thing is, do you guys think you have actually what it takes to do all this underground stuff?
No.
I don't think I do. I'd like to think I'd be
gutless.
brave enough to be like, I'll collect all this information and defect, but no, I think I'd be too chicken shit.
How about you, Jack? Do you think you could do it?
Oh, it would be terrifying. I mean, just not even terrifying in the moment when you're gathering that data, but just terrified your entire life that somebody's gonna,
Right?
kill you out of the blue,
Or torture you? Like,
I don't know if I could live.
Yeah, you have to be very clear at this point that if Oleg is found out, he is going to get taken to the basement of the KGB building and shot in the back of the neck. So
if he's lucky, that'd be quick.
It's incredibly courageous, and I think when you read books about spies, a lot of them are about what does it take to be a spy, and obviously there has to be a sense of hurt that you want to address. There has to be a certain bravery, and maybe a love, an adrenaline rush. Like a lot of them are just in love with having secrets. And I think
there has to be that, right? Like they'd have to be that, or like test pilots or something. They need that rush of, this I could die.
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
need that rush. I'm good.
I feel like we kind of touched on it a little bit too, seeing all of this stuff happen. I feel like you got to be pissed. Like, you got to be really angry at something to start being that brave.
But interestingly, like his family haven't suffered. I mean, I think if he had known, if you've got family who die in the Prague Spring, or I don't know, if you're in the Soviet Union and you're at the bottom of the rung, but he was kind of like the creme de la creme. Like he had no personal reason other than not being able to listen to Mozart to not like this regime, which is amazing to me. It makes it braver because it wasn't about like redressing a personal wrong, which is the only thing I can think of that would motivate me to do this, is vengeance for like a family member that I loved or something. I really admire
Don't withhold the guy's Mozart.
Yeah, exactly. Don't take away my George R. R. Martin. I might get angry.
Exactly.
Okay, so what was happening at this time is you typically do 3 years in a foreign country, then be recalled. So in 1970, Oleg and his wife Yelena come back to Russia. He's 32, and he realizes that to get another foreign posting, he needs to, make himself attractive to the authorities. So he learns French. He applies to learn English. At this point, he doesn't know this, but his friend Standa Kaplan defects and mentions Gordievsky may be susceptible to defecting too. Typically, when you defect, when you offer to spy for another country, the first thing they'll ask you is, are there any of our agencies that have been infiltrated? And secondly, who else can we approach? So you have to think that now on Oleg's kind of security card is the fact that he may be gay and he may be willing to defect. And at this point, also, Vasily dies and is given a hero's funeral. He's quite young. So, 1972, Oleg is sent
Wait a minute,
back.
how did he die?
He died, actually, I think it was just drinking, like of an illness. So, complications related to alcoholism, effectively. But yeah, he wasn't, I think he was around 40. He's given a proper hero's funeral, though. But at this point...
Did you know?
Sorry.
I was going to say, did you know that during the 98 downturn from the economic downturn that started in Thailand and went to Russia and everything, that the life expectancy for the average Russian dropped 25 years due to booze intake because they were drinking a lot and really bad, shitty bathtub kind of vodka?
Doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
But that's just scary. Anyway, so where are we? 1972. Oleg's 34, and he goes back to Copenhagen, still with a wife, even though the marriage is basically over. So at this point, there is a British MI6 agent in Copenhagen called Richard Bromhead, who has a cultivated look of stupidity. He comes across as a kind of slightly he's cultivated a look of stupidity. He comes across as a little bit bumbling, quite posh, a bit, we have a saying in England, Tim nice but dim, someone who is basically a little bit posh but stupid, but he's actually really, really clever. And he starts sort of just turning up at parties where Oleg's going to be, sort of embassy parties, and kind of tries to sort of sound out whether Oleg is willing to not defect, but start spying. So in 1973, they arrange for Standa to turn up in Copenhagen, and seek out Oleg and just meet him for lunch and to see what he's thinking. And the fact that Oleg doesn't close the door to Stander but actually goes for lunch with him is a signal to the British that Oleg's willing to take the risk of being seen with a defector. So basically, this is how the recruitment happens. It's early morning, and Richard Bromhead knows that he's being tailed by the KGB because all the spies tail each other. And he sneaks out of his house first thing in the morning in his wife's car and goes to a badminton court where Oleg plays early morning badminton and asks him for lunch. And the first lunch they have is officially sanctioned. So Oleg asks his superior if he can meet Bromhead for lunch, claiming that he's going to try and recruit Bromhead. And there's this little kind of like tango, this little dance between them. And officially, on the 1st of October 1974, age 36, Bromhead meets Oleg again on a badminton court, and they arrange a meeting without Soviet permission. And that's when he officially becomes Agent Sunbeam. Isn't that cute? Sunbeam.
Wait. Sunbeam?
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, Sunbeam.
That sounds like a Care Bear.
I know. It's so cute. At which point Richard Bromhead goes home and he gets a proper handler called Philip Hawkins. And the basic idea is that every month Philip Hawkins is going to fly in from London. They're going to meet in a safe flat, and Oleg is going to debrief him on all the information he's managed to observe. So he starts
debrief,
spying.
if you know what I mean, right?
Did think he was gay.
Well, exactly.
That was a joke.
So the first good news that Oleg gives them is that there aren't actually any Soviet spies that have managed to penetrate Denmark. But
Oh.
No one put the finger in the dike of Denmark yet?
No.
Is that the Netherlands?
That's the Netherlands.
I was confused.
But what he does tell them is that there's a guy called Arne Trehold. He's the son of a Norwegian minister. He's basically spying against the Norwegian government. And he also tells them that there's a woman. This is actually really sad. She's called Gunvor Galtung Harvik. And apparently
Trips off the tongue.
In World War II, when Norway was occupied, she fell in love with a Russian prisoner of war. And then after the war went to work for the foreign ministry. And the Soviets recruited her by saying that if she stole secrets from the foreign ministry for them, that they would reunite her with her lover, and if not, they would torture him and kill him. Which was all bollocks because he was, he
was dead.
Yeah. So she spied for them for years, actually, absolute years, looking like she just looks like a secondary school teacher, just very unassuming, and was just like hardcore spy, but kind of for a very tragic reason. So he's already been like super helpful. How he does it is apparently all the instructions from the Soviet Union, from the KGB, come on these microfilm tapes. And he kind of, each department, like within the Soviet embassy, would receive the bit that was to do with their department. So he would take his one and any others he would find lying around, go out on his lunch break, give them to his then handler, Jerry Guscott, who would photograph them in that lunch hour and then give them back to him. So yeah, it's kind of like, the information starts running.
Jesus.
It's kind of interesting to me that they would devote all the resources to have a Soviet spy tail a British spy, but that they wouldn't have people tail their own people to watch for defecting.
I think they had to have, too.
But they are the people. Like, who are you going to put on your people? They are the people who are meant to be tailing the people, right? Like, who watches the watchman? I mean, he was watched. I mean, people in the embassy, he had to do this secretly. This was like early in the morning, blah, 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 meet in a secret place. But ultimately, yeah, he got away with it, effectively. So in this period, he falls for Layla, who is a typist working for the World Health Organization. She's Armenian, I believe. Still, it's kind of like, it's tricky to divorce because it's going to affect his career. So Harvik, the Norwegian lady, she's arrested in 1977 and confesses. But there is this kind of thing about like, how much do you act on the information that your spies give you, because you don't want to risk exposing the spy. So he's giving them all this like really cool info, but it's kind of like, it's like Enigma, isn't it? When you got all the Enigma intelligence, how far do you use it?
You can't be right 100% of the time or else they'll know.
Yeah. So
they still do that now with terror plots and stuff like that. They wait until weird times to either stop them or like right to the last minute, so they don't know exactly where they're getting their information from, and it's just kind of weird.
Yeah, so they leave Arne Treholt, the other Norwegian spy, out in the open because they just figure he's actually not maybe being so harmful, and they can't blow. If you had too many people blown from the Scandinavian region, it'd be obvious there's someone leaking from that office. Right. So summer 1978, he's been spying now for a good sort of 3-4 years. He's recalled to Moscow, which is the routine recall. And this causes a big issue for MI6 because they're like, what do they do when he's in Moscow?
Wait, do I know this story? Did they sneak him out on a jet in an exchange and now he lives in like Virginia or something?
No. He lives in Virginia. I thought you were onto something, but you're not. Okay. Okay, so they make this decision that they're just going to let him lie fallow, that they're not going to endanger him by making contact at all while he's in Moscow. They'll just wait for him to get another posting, and if he wants to contact them, he will. But it's absolutely, they're on tenterhooks because he's like one of their most valuable agents. But they do have to arrange, because obviously there's a duty of care to your spies, right? So they have to have a plan that if he's blown for any reason when he gets back to Moscow, that they can get him out to safety. And they call this Operation Pimlico, and it's devised by a woman, real name, we don't know, alias Veronica Price. And at this point, no one has ever successfully exfiltrated anyone from the Soviet Union. Getting someone out from Copenhagen or even East Berlin is one thing, but Soviet Union is another. It's basically a big prison camp. So I'll get into the details of what that plan was later, but just so you know, the entire time when he's in Moscow, every single week, the most important task of the head of MI6 in Moscow is to know this plan and to have his people monitor if Oleg has sent up a signal. The duty of care to him, actually, when I was reading all this stuff, was really impressive. I guess my presumption would have been quite cynical that we would have just left him to it in Moscow, but it was actually really impressive how much they cared about his safety. They didn't need it, but he was there for 4 years, so from 1972 to 1978 to 1982, he's in Moscow, and they have literally no contact with him whatsoever.
1982 was a good year, let me tell you.
Is that when you were born?
Yep.
Oh, God, I feel so
That's
old.
Interesting that they took so much personal interest to him because, if he had been compromised and they had to get him out, it's not like he's useful at that point afterwards.
But it's a moral thing, isn't it? He's risked his life, so...
Yeah.
So,
cool.
So we just covered 20 years of spydom through the 60s and 80s, to the early 80s. That must have been such a weird time because,
he was only really spying from the mid 70s through to 78, right? Or early 70s. But yeah, it's the Brezhnev era, it's the build-up of nuclear weaponry, it's hardcore arms race time.
But also the changing technology just to be a spy. Before, their espionage camps, you Brits taught us, our OSS guys, how to, infiltrate and whatever and collect information. And now there's just, a proliferation of gadgets and shit like that you can use. Like you said, with microfilm. I don't know how old microfilm is, but...
There's a funny passage in one of the books I was reading where it's they needed a miniature camera to film this microfilm, and they were like, oh, the CIA would have tons of this, but we're kind of the poor relation and we don't have one, so they had to get such special permission to get this camera. But I think when you're talking about the duty of care, Jack, it's also the fact that this is post Kim Philby, post Cambridge Spies, MI6, where their reputation has been really burnt, especially in the eyes of the CIA and their allies. And I think the prestige of having a spy who is, relatively senior in the KGB is huge. This is an asset that is of so much value to them. And it's their way of redeeming themselves from the whole Cambridge Spies scandal. So I think there's a moral reason for care, but there's also a kind of more self-interested reason. So we have this 4 years where they're very stressed. They have no contact with him. He divorces and remarries Layla, has 2 little daughters, learns English.
In 4 years?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
He's an incredibly impressive linguist.
Cunning?
Cunning linguist.
But Oh dear. This is the bit that I find amazing. So he's sitting in Moscow Center, like in the center of the KGB, and he's like calling up all these files, any file that they have related to Soviet penetration, of England.
Yeah.
He's calling up to read, and like no one gets suspicious. And he's like, and if they do get suspicious, like, well, I just want to improve my English. And I want to be posted to London Station eventually, so I just want to like be a good student and learn about everything that is happening in the UK.
That's amazing.
But obviously he can't take notes, so he has to just memorize all this information. So not only is he an amazing linguist, but like, can you imagine the memory of just like reading all these files so that you can download them one day to MI6? It's just amazing. One of the ways in which he improved his English was translating reports written by Kim Philby, who is still actively advising the KGB. Treacherous shit that he is.
So, but he's living large, right? They got him all locked up in like some posh KGB thing.
Oh yeah, and he's getting his marmalade shipped in from England and reading the cricket scores in the Times, and just, don't get me started on Kim Philby. I have such a lack of respect for that man.
But he's a crown jewel to the KGB. He's like,
of course,
look, we made them look foolish, not, like.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess, by revenge, MI6 is hoping that Oleg will be their version of Philby. So they've had like literally no knowledge whether he's alive or dead since 1978. In 1981, a Danish diplomat goes to a party in Moscow and bumps into someone and says, we had this really lovely Soviet attaché over in Copenhagen called Oleg. Is he still around? And so at the next party, Oleg turns up and says to this Danish diplomat one sentence, quote unquote, I am learning to speak English. And of course, MI6 hears this and they're cock-a-hoop. They're like, yes, he's going to be coming to London. Because London, like the London Residentura in the sort of Soviet embassy in London is basically the heart of KGB activity. It's like the most important place that he's going to have his hands on like so much information that he can then give them. So yeah, they're super, super excited. So I am learning to speak English. So cool.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So in 1982, he shows up in London. He is age 44 now. His code name changes from Sunbeam to Nocton. Don't really know why Nocton, but anyway, there you go. The first sign they get of this is that his visa is sent in for approval. And actually, this is really traumatic for MI6 because normally if you get a visa from someone, you kind of ask all the other agencies if they have any information. It would have come back to them from the Danish security services that he was a suspected spy, so they should have refused it. But they approve it, and KGB doesn't think this is suspicious, which is kind of weird. So he goes to the London residency with his wife and his two daughters. They obviously love living in London. His little girls go to school there. They're very English. And he gets in touch with MI6 and just starts downloading all of this information. He meets them once a week in a safe house at lunchtime, and they just sit in a room, and he just downloads from his memory. It's so impressive.
Wow. Has anybody made a movie about this? This sounds like this would be a good movie.
No, and we haven't even got to the good bit yet. But okay, so this is the information that he downloads. First of all, I don't know if any of you know this, but there was this massive scandal after the Cambridge skies were exposed, where a journalist called Peter Wright was convinced that the head of MI5, Roger Hollis, was a spy. And this went on for years. And I even remember this from when I was a little girl, that Margaret Thatcher had to stand up in the House of Parliament, our Prime Minister. And there was this thing about whether his book was going to allowed to be published, accusing Roger Hollis. So Oleg Gordievsky confirmed that Roger Hollis was not a spy and cleared his name. He also confirmed that the fifth man, so Cambridge spies, there were 4 identified people and a mystery fifth man. Oleg confirmed that that was John Cairncross. The other thing that he confirmed was that there were no more Kim Philbys. In other words, he could reassure the British that they hadn't been re-infiltrated, which was hugely, obviously, reassuring. So that was great. But when he was in the Residentura, the Soviet embassy was approached by a really incompetent British MI6 agent called Michael John Bettany. He's a bit like Aldrich Ames, like just after the money, basically. And Gordievsky was immediately able to tell the British, look, this guy is a traitor. And the person who becomes head of MI6, Eliza Manningham Buller, who I've met and is incredibly impressive, catches this guy, Bettany, and he's put on trial and put in prison, and actually has since been released, served his time. But the most exciting thing that Gordievsky reveals is that this is 1982. The leader of the opposition is a man called Michael Foot, so leader of the Labour Party. And he reveals that back in the day, Michael Foot was a Soviet agent and was paid to give them information. However, this was in the 60s. In the 70s, actually after the Prague Spring, he was downgraded from agent to confidential contact. He had become disillusioned with the Soviet Union, realized that they were a bunch of brutes, and didn't cooperate in the same way. So this was very incendiary because at the time, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, was very unpopular. There was an election coming up, and Michael Foot could have been the next Prime Minister of England. So the question is do you tell the Prime Minister? Do you make this information public? What would you guys have done? Do you tell anyone that the potential future Prime Minister is a ex-Soviet agent?
I mean, if I'm a good patriotic Brit, which you know I am, I'd almost... You can't have somebody who leans that way in charge of the whole country, you know? You want somebody who's steadfastly on the British side.
The problem is like, even if he was pissed off with the Soviet Union by this point, which I think he probably was, could he have been blackmailed once Prime Minister? Like, you do this for us, otherwise we'll reveal that you're an agent. But amazingly, so the head of MI6 tells the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong, so the most senior civil servant, this news. And so Robert Armstrong decides that it's just too politically influential, like, to reveal this information, and he just sits on it. He doesn't tell the Prime Minister, he doesn't tell anyone. And all that he said cryptically was, well, if Michael Foot were elected Prime Minister, I would have told the Queen.
Oh, really?
Which I just find amazing. Like, what's the Queen going to do? Like, just say, I'm not going to ask Michael Foot to form a government? I mean, I don't know. I find that amazing. It's one of the kind of weird things about British politics and its unwritten constitution and the kind of weird power that the Queen has to kind of formally call on someone to form a government. It's such a kind of... I don't know, like, how did this guy know? Like, if it weren't for the Falkland War breaking out, which he couldn't have predicted, Thatcher wouldn't have won the next election. It just strikes me as amazing how close we came to having an ex-Soviet agent as our Prime Minister. But there we go.
Yeah, weird that a war would break out just in time.
Have you ever seen the movie Wag the Dog?
Yes.
That's what that whole movie is about.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that was it came out about the same time the Lewinsky thing was happening and the war in the Baltics. And I think that's what kind of influenced that whole movie, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
Although I thought it was supposed to be about, like, Somalia, too. I'm not sure. But, yeah, it's based on the Clinton stuff.
Anyway, that's all history. Thatcher became Prime Minister and the crisis was averted. So that's all about the kind of information he brought with him. One crisis was. The next section is about what he did while he was in London between 1982 and 1985, which I think cements his reputation as being basically one of the most influential spies in history and absolutely crucial in ending the Cold War. I mean, I cannot praise this guy enough. Basically, 1982, Andropov is in power in Soviet Union. He's ex-KGB. He's utterly paranoid. He 100% believes that the US and the UK are about to launch a first strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, which could not be further from the truth. But this is the time when Reagan is really amping up his Cold War rhetoric and talking about the evil empire and stuff, right? So we are dementia's
a hell of a thing.
We're very close to some seriously bad shit going on. So there's a NATO exercise called Abel Archer 83, where we're mobilizing tanks in West Germany and on the borders of Russia. And it's just a NATO exercise, but the Soviets are convinced we're about to attack, so they start mobilizing. And Gordievsky is able to tell MI6 this, and he briefs confidentially Thatcher and Reagan and tells them, you've got to sort of soften your rhetoric. And because of those briefings, Abel Archer was then modified and certain tank movements were then put in place which would without doubt tell the Russians that this was just a test. So you can go and Google stuff about Abel Archer 83 and, you know, various historians will argue about how close we came to an actual war in that period, but I think, you know, to me, that is the closest we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the person we unequivocally have to thank for the fact that it didn't go further is Oleg Gordievsky.
Good on Oleg.
But even cooler, so then obviously Gorbachev comes to power because Andropov dies, and Literally, when Gorbachev is meeting Thatcher and Reagan, he is officially briefing Gorbachev, because that is his job as head of London Station, but he's also briefing Thatcher and Reagan. So he's briefing Gorbachev and saying, these guys really don't want to go to war with you. You should really, they are really pro-reform and they will help you. You know, they're your friends. And he's simultaneously briefing Thatcher and Reagan and saying, you know the famous Thatcher phrase, "This is a man I can do business with." That's straight from Gordievsky. So the fact that these three leaders were in this like total Cold War loving is basically because Gordievsky was writing all of their briefing notes. So he totally brings them together. In the midst of this, Arne Trehold in Norway is finally arrested and confesses and goes to prison. He tells Thatcher that the Soviets are financing the miners' strikes. So all sorts of other stuff's going on. But I think that the major thing is basically that he's basically helping bring an end to the Cold War. At the same time, the motherfucking CIA does not like to be left out of a secret. Arseholes. And they hate the fact they're getting all this intelligence from the Brits, but don't know the real identity of the source. Actually, even Thatcher and Reagan don't know the name of the spy. And Thatcher, for some reason of her own, starts calling him Mr. Collins. The CIA really want to know who this spy is. So Burton Gerber, who is the CIA chief of Soviet section, sets a little team up to try and find out his identity. And they know that because of the quality of what he's sending, he must be senior in the KGB. Because a lot of it's kind of to do with the UK, they think he must be based in London. Because people are now being arrested in Norway, they think he probably served in Norway. So they triangulate it down and they figure out that the person who really is the spy is Oleg Gordievsky. And this is important because one of the people who finds out the true identity of Oleg Gordievsky is Aldrich Ames.
Gulp.
Man.
Yeah, I know. So basically, we now get to 1985, and this is when shit gets real. Early April, 12 days before Gordievsky is due to become the head of the London residency. Actually, this is kind of interesting because when he came to London, he was third in line, and the British government just found reasons to expel the people above him in the chain of command as persona non grata so that he could become chief. So funny. 12 days before this is due to happen, so the crowning moment for MI6, right? Their spy is head of London agency. Ames offers his services to the KGB. 15th of May, Ames goes to work. He denies that he gives up Gordievsky at this point. I kind of think he's probably right at this point. 18th of May, $9,000 is deposited in a bank under Ames's name.
That's not a lot.
That's not a lot, but it's the first deposit, right? We know that the first thing that happens when you become a spy is people say, who else do you know who's penetrated the agency? We also know, because Ames has said this rather ruthlessly, that when he gave people up who could implicate him. And Gordievsky would have fallen into, he thinks, that category. 19th of May, 1985, Oleg is recalled to Moscow. And he is really nervous because he thinks this is unusual. He's been made head of London Station. He shouldn't have to go back. He's been confirmed in London. Why are they calling him back? MI6 is really nervous. They sit him down and say, look, you've already done so much. If you want to defect now, your wife and kids are with you here in London. We will financially support you. You can just stay. But he feels that he's so close to kind of being this very important guy and there's more to do. And quote unquote, he says, I would die for Britain. I mean, that's more than betraying your country. That's kind of, I don't know. I mean, that's pretty hardcore, right?
Yeah.
So he goes back to Moscow as soon as, without his wife and kids, because it's just him called back. As soon as he lands, he's put under house arrest. So he knows he's been betrayed. Or at least that they have very hardcore suspicions about him. Now, Operation Pimlico, the operation to extract him from Russia, has carried on going. And he's been given, when he goes back, a kind of like an emergency pack by MI6, which has all the things he needs for Operation Pimlico. But it also includes pet pills, which I think are kind of like caffeine pills. He takes one of these before he goes to the office on the day. He didn't realize this, that he was going to be drugged and interrogated. And he's given a drug whereby not only do you give up your secrets, but also you don't remember afterwards that you've been drugged, which is kind of pretty awesome.
So it's like roofies?
Yeah, I guess. But anyway, whatever was in this pet pill that he took, for whatever reason, he managed to survive the interrogation. He didn't give up the fact that he was a spy. And he says, at this point, I just remembered that Kim Philby said never confess. So there you go.
Oh.
But he survived
So he was
5-hour interrogation under hardcore druggage, which is amazing to me.
So amphetamines counteract whatever truth serum, sodium benzoyl, or whatever they call it.
I guess.
Man.
In the intervening time, his wife is brought back and his children are brought back to Moscow. And then he knows he's fucked, because even though they don't have evidence to convict him, and apparently the KGB is really legalistic, like they don't just take you down and shoot you in the back of the head. They have to have evidence before they do that, which amazed me. So they have suspicions.
What?
They have suspicions. That they don't know. Like, apparently when you're a colonel in the KGB, you get the right to have actual evidence. They have no evidence on him. They just have suspicions. So they bring back the wife and kids, and he knows he's fucked, because basically they can hold them as hostages, right? I mean, it is what it is. Pimlico is now on high alert. 13th of June, 1985, Aldrich Ames betrays 25 people spying against the Soviets, including Gordievsky. So KGB has its evidence now. The single biggest betrayal by a US citizen, I guess, in history. What amazes me about Aldrich Ames is, like, he just did it for money. It's so horrid. I don't know. It just seems like, as much as I hate Philby, I think at some point Philby believed that fascism could only be defeated by communism, and I don't know. I just can't wrap my head around what Aldrich Ames did. So
Baffling to me that people can convince themselves of this stuff so late in the Cold War, you know? Like, if it's 1950 and not many people know much about the Soviet Union, it makes more sense to me, but you're talking about, like, the 1980s. Like,
I think
it's pretty
Ames
public
just
knowledge
wanted
that
money.
they're terrible.
I think Ames knew that they were terrible, but he had expensive taste and an expensive wife, and he needed cash.
Yeah, and that's really, like, I mean, that's how they honey trap so many of these people, right? It's like they either have a vice, or, you know, that's either used to blackmail them, or they just can promise them, you know, the best whatever, and they're like, yeah, I'm vain enough to go with that. Let's do that.
Don't you think that intelligence agencies, knowing that that's a common way that agents get turned, would just pay their agents, like, absurd amounts of money? Like, you make $5 million a year right now.
Yeah, but then you'd have to eventually justify that to some oversight committee, right? You know, like, sure, it's like, you know, the $5 million toilet or whatever, but someone would have to see that money going somewhere, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like it's worth it when you're talking about national security risks like that. I don't know.
I don't know. Anyways, for whatever reason, Ames has betrayed Gordievsky. Gordievsky knows this. He looks like shit. He's never smoked before. He's chain smoking. He's lost weight. He just looks like a wreck. Can't sleep. He has a decision. He knows that there's an exfiltration plan called Pimlico. And he knows that the British have prepared this plan that he can leave with his wife and 2 children, although, of course, that raises the risk. It's hard enough to get one person out, let alone 2 people, let alone 4 people when 2 of them are tiny kids. But he knows the plan is in place. Do you tell your wife, by the way, I love you, but for the last 10 years I've been a spy. You are now being held prisoner, effectively, even though you don't know it. And we need to leave this place and never come back. Do you trust her? Because she is also someone who was raised by, you know, parents who were KGB. Do you trust that she will believe what you believe? Do you think she'll betray you? Do you think she'll go with you? What do you do? Will she still love you enough to go with you when she finds out you've been lying to her for the last 10 years and put her life?
How long have they been married?
Since 1979, I think. So it's now 1985.
I mean, there's a good chance she doesn't love him anymore anyway.
No.
So I think he's probably all right. You tell your wife, and if she wants to go along, she has her window. If she doesn't, then
Oleg decides not
spiritual uncouple right there.
He decides not to tell his wife. He tells Lena to take the girls on a holiday to visit her family. She's still alive. I mean, people who've interviewed her since say that if he had told her, she would have let him go. She wouldn't have told the KGB because she believes that his reasons for spying were honorable, but that she didn't make that decision and that she would have stayed. You know, she's got family there. She didn't choose the life of a defector. So he could have told her, but he didn't. And I think that's brutal. That is the most brutal sacrifice of this case. So he tells Layla to take the girls on holiday, and he tries to make a brush contact with MI6 at some Vassals, which is pre-planned. He can't because he gets to the church and the staircase is closed for repairs, so it fails. That's 13th of June. We're now 16th of July. KGB still don't have a confession from him, and it's a point of contention why they haven't brought him in earlier. One of the mistakes in the case, but he is still at liberty. So this is the end game now of this Vollop, and this is where it gets really cool and really interesting. So Tuesday, 16th of July, 1985. And by the way, people don't read about this stuff on Wiki. They get almost every detail wrong. If you really want to read about this, there's a fantastic book by Ben McIntyre called The Traitor and the Spy, and it's an amazing read, and I would strongly recommend it. So Tuesday, the 16th of July, Oleg Gordievsky is wearing, as prearranged with MI6, grey trousers, a grey cap. He is waiting on a street corner outside the Hotel Ukraine in Moscow. On that street corner, he is carrying a Safeway bag as a signal at 7 p.m., and he has instructions to wait there for half an hour. The MI6 agent who's meant to be there every day to see if he turns up is late. 7:40, rushes back. He walks past Oleg carrying a Harrods bag, chewing a Mars bar. The two make eye contact. That is the signal that the guy will have a Harrods bag and will be chewing a Mars bar. This indicates that he's recognized the signal and the escape plan is a go. Wednesday, 17th of July, 1985. Oleg has to sort of take various routes around Moscow to lose the KGB tails who are on him, and buys train tickets to Leningrad. He takes out cash for his wife to leave on the counter. He goes home and he cleans up his flat. He knows it's going to be searched, and he has a kind of pride that it should look in order when he goes. The head of MI6 station in Moscow is an aristo called Viscount Roy Ascot, who later becomes an earl. He's got a wife called Caroline and a little tiny baby called Florence, and they are going to make up a story that the people who are bugging their flat can listen to. So the story is that the deputy chief of MI6 in Moscow, Arthur G., his wife Rachel puts on this big kind of like song and dance show for the KGB people listening in, that she's got this extreme back pain and that she needs to go to Finland to get it treated. Because that was very normal at the time, that people who were stationed in the Soviet Union, like when they're expats, would drive up to Finland for the weekend and get whatever they needed to get. So the idea is that she said to Caroline, oh, let's make a weekend of it, like there's two couples. And then in Viscount Roy Ascot, it's like, oh, do we really have to go? The new ambassador, which is true, was turning up. This isn't a time to leave. But anyway, the two couples make this trip to leave the Soviet Union by car. Thursday, 18th of July, 1985. Oleg spends the day with his sister and mother. He obviously doesn't say goodbye to them, but spends some time with them. He knows he'll never see them again. He might be dead by the end of the week. He calls his friend, a fellow Anglophile spy called Lyubimov, I believe. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. And he says to him on the telephone that he knows is bugged by the KGB. And this is a guy who's read lots of English literature too. Have you read Mr. Harrington's Washing by Somerset Maugham? Luckily, this comment goes straight by the KGB, because if you read Mr. Harrington's Washing by Somerset Maugham, it's a story of a spy who escapes Russia by going up through Finland. So, pretty boring.
So he basically sent them a roadmap of what he's about to do, and they're too stupid to see it?
They haven't read English literature, because the average KGB spy, it doesn't give a shit. So, Thursday, the 18th of July, while he's dropping this hint on the telephone, Charles Pole, who is Margaret Thatcher's sort of right-hand man, flies up from London to Balmoral, the Queen's estate. Every summer, the Prime Minister of England goes up to stay with the Queen in Balmoral to get the personal okay from Margaret Thatcher that this exfiltration can go ahead. Because obviously, if it goes wrong, if the Soviets catch you trying to get a man out, or indeed a family out, which is what the MI6 is expecting, this could throw off all the Cold War thawing and all the negotiations that are going on, right? This will utterly compromise our relationship with Gorbachev. He tries to get into Balmoral Castle. The equerry who's guarding the gate is apparently on the phone with the Queen, because the Queen wants to borrow the Queen Mother's video recorder so she can watch Dad's Army, which is a really bad British sitcom. And this conversation goes on for 45 minutes. And Charles
45
Pole,
minutes talking about watching a TV show?
and like when she can go in and get the video recorder and can I borrow it? And like Charles Pole is getting more and more nervous, saying, look, I need to speak to the Prime Minister. And the security guys, well, number one, I'm on the phone arranging for the Queen to get her video recorder from her mum. Number two, you're not on the list of visitors who are pre-approved. I don't know who you are, so you're not getting in. 45 minutes later, Charles Pole finally just barges past this person, goes to see Thatcher and says, what are we going to do? Do we go ahead with this? And she immediately says, yeah, she said, it doesn't matter what happens with negotiations, I will sort it out. But this man, she still doesn't know his name or who he is. This man who has been so helpful to her, we have a duty of care towards him. We get him out. So, Friday the 19th of July, 1985. If you need to drive your car to Finland, you need to get the official diplomatic plates changed on the car, apparently. But Caroline Ascot's license had been stolen some months earlier, and the replacement hadn't yet arrived, and you need to have 2 valid licenses from 2 drivers. Diplomats can't drive alone. So it looks like the plan is kiboshed, and the only garage that can change the plates closes at midday on a Friday. But somehow, by some stroke of luck, her new license arrives in the post at 11 a.m, and they can just get the plates changed. I mean, talk about luck. So they go to the ambassador's drinks. The new British ambassador arrives at 7 o'clock in the evening. He, by the way, is not as noble as Margaret Thatcher. He's furious because he thinks he'll be the shortest lived ambassador in British history, because as soon as the Soviets find out, they'll declare him persona non grata and get rid of him. But anyway, so they have the ambassador's drinks at 7. That finishes, and at 11:15 the 2 cars leave. So you've got the 2 top people in MI6 and their wives and the little baby. They take Florence the baby. This will become significant later. Oleg is cleaning his flat. He leaves the money. He boards the overnight train to Leningrad, takes a sleeping pill. He wakes up in the morning and discovers that he's in the bottom bunk, and he doesn't understand why, because he went to sleep in the top bunk. He realizes he's covered in blood, and apparently when the train was like shaking, like rolling in the middle of the night, he fell out of the bunk.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So he's trying to be as unconspicuous as possible, and he's like walking through this train utterly covered in blood all over his clothes.
Oh, Jesus.
I know, not good. Anyway, so it's now Saturday, the 20th of July, 1985. It's 5 a.m. in the morning. Oleg has arrived in Leningrad. He takes a taxi to the Finland station, so the other train station that takes you to the Finnish border. Gets there at 5:45. He's got an hour's wait to take the train to the Finnish border. The KGB surveillance team, who's meant to be watching his flat in Moscow, suddenly realise that he's not in his flat. But fearing that they're going to be sacked and reprisals, they don't report this to their seniors, which is a huge stroke of luck. Meanwhile, the two sets of British couples reach Leningrad, and they take a 2-hour break. 8:45, Oleg boards the bus. He's got to the sort of the furthest point he can get to, near the Finnish border, and he takes a bus. The plan is they're going to meet in a lay-by on the motorway to the border crossing, and the lay-by is kind of hidden from the main road, so they can do a quick exchange. He gets there. He lies down in the grassland near the lay-by, and there's so many mosquitoes biting him. And the rendezvous isn't until 2:30 in the afternoon. So rather than sit inconspicuously, he decides, and I can't believe he did this, he decides to hitchhike into Viborg, which is the nearest town. And he's sitting in a cafe eating beer and chicken at midday.
What?
I know. Anyway, so he's eating this beer and chicken. And then he decides, okay, I better get back to the lay-by because I'm getting picked up at 2:30. And he can't get a lift. There's no one on the road for him to hitchhike with. So he suddenly has to run all the way to get to the rendezvous.
Oh my God.
So this is where the fact that he's kept in fitness as a long-distance runner actually comes in useful. So by the time he gets to the lay-by, he's absolutely covered in sweat. He's knackered. He lies down in the bush and he's getting like sort of bitten by mosquitoes. So 1:30, meanwhile, the 2 sets of Brits in the cars are driving up this road. Unsurprisingly, they're being tailed by the KGB. And they realise that if the KGB is still on them, they're not going to be able to pick up Oleg. So they've got 2 cars in front, 2 cars behind is the classic pattern. So Viscount Astor decides to go really slow in the car. And obviously the KGB then go really slow, and then all the cars behind them have to go really slow and start pipping their horns and getting pissed off. So then the KGB kind of get ashamed and kind of speed up and go ahead. And then they drop behind at some point. So then, because he's in a better car, right? They're in European cars, not Soviet shitty cars, larders. So at some point, the Soviets go behind them, and they absolutely slam on the accelerator, speed up. They get into the lay-by just before, visually, the Soviet cars come up, the KGB cars come up behind them. So the KGB doesn't know they've gone into the lay-by and carry on.
What?
It's like something from a cartoon.
It's like a Marx Brothers.
I know. And they're just sitting there, and the wife of the ambassador's like, I just really hope that the KGB couldn't see the dust as we turned off the road, because that would have given us away. Within 80 seconds, Oleg gets into the boot of one of the cars. The Brits realise he hasn't brought his family with him, so that's a big thing. He gets into the boot. He has to strip naked of his clothes. And bear in mind, his clothes are like probably covered with radioactive dust, because that was standard KGB practice, was to give you enough radioactive dust that they could track you anywhere with a Geiger counter, not enough to kill you.
What?
Yeah. And they would do that to MI6 and everyone. They probably still do it now, actually. So he's stripping himself naked in the boot. So in the boot, he's trying to strip himself naked. He wraps himself in this big reflective sheet because the British believe that the Finnish border has kind of heat seekers, so they can see if there's anyone being smuggled out. So it's something to kind of prevent them from knowing there's a body in the boot. The problem is they drive off in the car towards the border, and they motor past the KGB. The KGB have pulled up on the side of the road because they don't know where the Brits have gone. So they just drive straight past them to the border. Oh, anyway.
What?
I know. It's like something out of a cartoon, isn't it?
Yeah, oh my God.
Anyway.
And these are the people that effectively were ruling the entire, or ruling half of the planet.
I mean, they're just morons. Utter morons. Anyways, they get to the border with Finland. The two men get out and start, you've got to go to the booth and fill out the paperwork, which you can imagine is very voluminous. And there's multiple border checks. I think there's 3 Soviet border checks. There's 2 Finnish border checks. I mean, it's just a nightmare. Meanwhile, the wife in the car realizes there's a pretty pungent smell coming out of the trunk of the car, because this is a guy who hasn't washed for 2 days. He's been on an overnight train. He's run the miles back to the lay-by. He's sweating because of the adrenaline. And it's like a very pungent sort of Soviet unwashed kind of smell.
I can only imagine.
So this is
turnips and borscht eking out of his pores.
Yeah. And it's a really hot day. It's July, right? Like in those days, you didn't have air conditioning. It's a metal tin can he's locked in it. Yeah.
In those days, it's the late 80s, Bina.
Anyway, so this is where this story gets, to me, genius. So she has, I don't know if you have these in the States, but in Britain we have a flavour of potato chip called cheese and onion. And it's just this fake hardcore cheddar cheese and pickled onion smell kind of comes out.
Sour cream onion.
Yeah, it's way more pungent. So she's got bags of these that she's bought from the expat shopping store where they have British crisps. And she's trying to eat them, but sprinkling them over the back seats so the car smells of cheese and onion crisps.
Jesus Christ.
And then the sniffer. So then the guards with the sniffer dogs come to check all the cars, right? It's not just them, but normally they would check in the boot or whatever. Now there is a convention that you don't check diplomatic cars, but it's not a law, so they could still be checked, especially when there's a pungent smell of Soviet bloke in the back of it. Yeah. So she basically takes baby Florence, puts her on the trunk of the car, so that obstructing their ability to open it. And very conveniently, Florence is just on a massive shit. So she changes the nappy. And as the sniffer dog comes to the back of the car, she drops the dirty nappy next to the dog, who naturally buggers off.
Oh. So wait a minute, who is this lady? And
she's the ambassador's wife. The ambassador's wife.
But she's no one, really. She's just the ambassador's wife. She's not a spy or anything. She just comes up with this shit off the top of her head.
But you have to remember, this goes back to the point I said before, that ever since Oleg started spying for the Brits, the most important job of the ambassador or the head of MI6 in Moscow was to prepare for Pimlico. So before you were sent off, you, as the head of MI6, would go to the woods in Surrey, where I live, and practice putting someone in the back of a car. They practiced injecting into oranges because they knew they would have to give the kids sedatives if they came with. So you practiced injecting into something that felt like injecting into a kid. She was just a normcore wife, but she would have been preparing for this ever since they were posted. But it's still amazing, right, that the kid happened to do a shit. They happened to change the nappy. I mean, it's just... the luck was on their side, right? But that little girl who's now grown up and was, Anyway, so they assume...
She's like, I took a shit.
I know, and I saved a man's life. So they assume that their cars are bugged. Like the whole time on this drive, they haven't been able to talk about anything. So the tension's building, And all the way on the trip, they're really into Doctor Hook. So they've been playing Doctor Hook, which apparently Oleg's like, this was the biggest torture was having to listen to Doctor Hook through the border crossing.
What is Doctor Hook?
It's like this cheesy 70s kind of rock band. Like it's like not good music for someone who like prides themselves on liking Mozart and Bach. So how they signalled to Oleg that they'd got through the border is they started playing this Sibelius symphony called Finlandia, which I think is really lovely, at 3:15, and he's basically over the border in Finland. Now, you might think at this point that Oleg is free, but he's not, because even though Finland is technically not Soviet Union, there is a great saying in Finland, which is there's always an army in your country. It's either yours or the Russians. And Finland had a policy of basically cooperating with the Soviet Union. So if any KGB defector came through, they would ship them back. So even though they're in Finland, they're still not quite safe. So a week before the extraction, the head of MI6 had called up the head of the Finnish Secret Service, which is called Sappo, and his name is Seppo Titinen, so that's, helpful. Seppo from Sappo, and said, listen, mate, hypothetically, if we were to exfiltrate a Soviet agent through Finland, would you rather know about it after it happened? And Seppo's like, yes, I would very much want to know about it very much after it had happened.
Better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Exactly. So they drive over the border. 20 minutes later, they pull into a lay-by. Oleg meets Veronica Price, who'd come up with a Pimlico pan all those years earlier, and some of the others who he knew who'd been handling him. He gets a change of clothes. He tries to shave in some water, but it doesn't really work. But a phone call they make from a phone booth back to MI6, where they just say the weather's excellent. The head of MI6 then rings Seppo from Sappo and says, look, this is what we've done. And he says, was any force used? And he's like, no force was used. He's like, fine, off you go. They drive up to Helsinki. They have dinner that night. They carry on driving up on Sunday, the 21st of July now, to the Norwegian border, so up through Finland to Norway. They cross the border, and that truly is freedom. From there, they fly to Oslo and then London. And Monday, the 22nd of July, Oleg Gordievsky is lying in South Ormsby Hall in Lincolnshire, which is a country manor house of Downton Abbey type. It is the seat of the Massingbird Mundy family.
Sure.
Which
sure
apparently is a family
right?
who just helps out MI6 and just, lets people chill. And then he goes to Fort Monkton near Gosport, which is MI6's most secure facility. And basically, that's the end of the story of Oleg being, exfiltrated. But it just amazes me that were it not for the license coming through, were it not for the low-level KGB people not wanting to get in trouble, the borders therefore not being closed, the goofball antics on the motorway, the nappy, the cheese and onion crisps. I mean...
Yeah, it was seriously a comedy of errors that got him across the border.
So he's alive in his mid-40s in England. And we get to the epilogue, basically. So Oleg, after the exfiltration, just becomes effectively like Kim Philby. He briefs Thatcher, he briefs Reagan, goes around the world to our allies, helping them out on security issues. The Queen, in 2007, awarded him the Companion of the Most Distinguished Order of St. Michael and St. George, which is actually the same honour that James Bond has in the novels. Yeah. He lives in a suburban house in Surrey, which is kind of near where I live, obviously under an assumed name. I think probably a quite lonely existence, but he has huge influence on shaping how people think about Cold War, and he becomes a bit of a national treasure. Like we have this radio program called Desert Island Discs where the great and the good talk about their favorite music. He's on that. I mean, he really is like, a bit of a national treasure.
Do you think he likes Dr. Hook now?
No, I think he still hates Dr. Hook. He obviously comes over in 85 without his wife and daughters. The wife is arrested, is interrogated for days and hours and weeks, put under a house arrest for years, effectively. It's tragic what happens to her. Every time Margaret Thatcher meets Gorbachev, she immediately asks if they will let Layla and the children come to England. He always says no. 6 years later, basically, the Soviet Union comes to an end. And that is when Layla and the children come to London. And they're reunited with Oleg. But of course, the marriage has just disintegrated.
Yeah. Dude, she was tortured and, like, house arrest. And the children were probably sent to, like, re-education. Like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's like the tragic price that he paid, right? I mean, Layla now lives between UK and Russia. The girls apparently were educated here. And live here, but I think it's a very lonely life. I mean, both he and Kim Philby just end up basically living these very isolated lives. The Soviet authorities sentenced Gordievsky to death in absentia for treason. In 2008, the media reported that in November 2007, Gordievsky had been taken by ambulance from his home in Surrey to a local hospital where he spent 34 hours unconscious. He had been poisoned with thallium by rogue elements in Moscow.
This.
Yeah.
Was this the umbrella guy? The umbrella pellet?
Yeah. Ever since the Skripal attack earlier this year in England, he has been subject to elevated security. It is strongly believed that one of the people he exposed when he was a spy was one of Putin's mentors, and that if Putin can get him, he probably will. So even though the guy's now in his, I guess, late 70s, he's still alive and kicking, lives in Surrey probably. I mean, every time I drive up the A3, I think, oh God, I wonder if like Oleg Gordievsky lives around here. But he's still basically someone who is at risk. But I truly believe that he helped the Cold War happen. There was this vast gulf of misunderstanding between Thatcher, Gorbachev and Reagan, and he helped bring them together. So from my perspective, he truly is. I think a lot of spying probably doesn't do much good. Like we do stuff and they do stuff and it kind of evens out. I think this was major, and just what a cool escape story. Someone should totally make a movie of it. It's amazing.
Yeah,
I'm surprised someone hasn't.
Yeah, and well, all the information hasn't been known until recently. I mean, he wrote an autobiography quite recently. Obviously, some of the files get released, but I think you have to go and interview people and find out what the true story is. And as I said before, I would really recommend people. There's a relatively new book by Ben McIntyre that I think kind of gets the dates and the kind of the process of the escape right. The Wikipedia page is still hopelessly wrong. But yeah, so that was my Vollop. I hope you enjoyed it. It wasn't Cambridge Spies, but I still think it's a really cool story.
Yeah,
that was great.
Pretty cool.
Poor Oleg. He's going to get polonium tea, isn't he?
You hope not.
I hope not.
That kind of reminds me of like, the NSA guy who leaked a bunch of stuff.
Snowden?
Yeah, that guy now has to basically hide for the rest of his life in Russia.
Yeah.
The difference is there was no one because Snowden didn't defect to someone. There was no one to praise him. Whereas Oleg Gordievsky, once he was like out, he was, he got knighted by the Queen effectively. He met Thatcher, yeah. He met Reagan. He got all the kind of the positive plaudits of that. But I still think it's very lonely. I mean, ultimately, once he'd escaped, he became he was just paraded around by British intelligence. Like, look at this cool spy we had. Look what we achieved.
Yeah.
I think it's sad.
And you assume he probably can't travel much. I mean, it's not like he can go to vacation in Poland if he wants to.
And at this point, who would want to? They're basically going back to Soviet-style government anyway. So for him, do you think that with him and certain other like historical figures that they can look back with satisfaction? You say like it's a very lonely life. So is his only gratification that he did so much to make the two sides of the Cold War, understand each other better, and then eventually, end it not amicably, but without the nuclear violence that we expected?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you genuinely believe that Abel Archer was like the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we came very close to catastrophic hot war, and he prevented that, then I think he's a real hero. And he cleared people's names. Roger Hollis there were people out there who he cleared of suspicion, whose lives were living hell. So I think he did great things, and what I like about him is that he genuinely did them for a good reason, which is he believed in freedom, even if it was as much artistic as political. He believed in that it was right and good for people to live a rich, diverse life where they had lots of influences that weren't dictated by the state. And although actually the British did pay him a little bit of money, they created a bank account for him. When he met with MI6, he said, "I don't want to be paid." And MI6 kind of insisted because paying someone is a means of control over them, you know.
Right.
But I think of all the spies I've read about, like Burgess and Maclean and Philby and all these people, and there's a sliding scale and a mix of factors of why you spy. It just feels to me like he was one of the most successful, B purist, and C sacrificed his family to do it. You know, and he loved Britain. He's like, you know, if you go back to Moscow and you know there's a very high chance you're going to be shot in the basement in the back of the head, and you say, "I'm willing to die for Britain," and you're not even British, I just feel like I just have to give you some respect and props for that. I wouldn't have the courage. I just wouldn't have the courage.
No. Well, that's a very good story.
Good.
It's very. I think in the time of geopolitics that we're in, it's very weird to see and to kind of get reminded of how the world was not too long ago, and why things like NATO and, you know, the Warsaw Pact existed, and how those have how those were really globalistic and not nationalistic entities. And, you know, we're kind of seeing a trend more towards nationalism, especially with you Brexit people making me lose all my money in Lloyd's. But that the situation in the world, like, really required these multinational organizations, and, you know, maybe that the dissolving of them at this point may not be to the benefit, as they might be still needed.
I think it's also, for me, just fascinating that, you know, 1983, Abel Archer, that's in my lifetime, just about in yours, Matt, that within our lifetimes. This isn't like a, you know, Cuban Missile Crisis. This was real, you know, not very long ago that we could have had hot war.
Yeah, and, you know, it just shows how stupid we are that we think that destroying each other is winning somehow.
But anyway, the moral of the story is always carry a bag of cheese and onion crisps, because you never know when it might come in handy.
I always do.
Apparently, one of the things that when he defected and the KGB finally figured out what had happened, the thing that blew their mind the most was that the British had taken a baby on that trip. They couldn't believe that they would have put a baby in danger like that.
Wow.
Dear. But yeah,
I didn't even think of that.
Never know when you need a full diaper to throw off a sniffer dog.
Really? Alrighty.
On that happy note, leave you all to the rest of your days. Thank you.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
Thank you to Matt, and thank you to Jack for joining. And thank you to all of you for listening. Hope you found it interesting. And stay tuned for another Vollop when someone decides to actually take on the Cambridge spies. Okay, cool. Over and out.
Alright, bye guys.
Bye.
Bye.
There ain't nobody spine like us. Hey, what do you say? Someone took your plans away. So what's all of us? There ain't nobody spine like us.
Political coups. It's very apropos in London today to speak of political coup, given what's going on.
Jesus Christ, that your goddamn government tanked my Lloyd's of London stock. Like fucking 6% yesterday.
On behalf of the British people, I apologise, Varley.
Yeah, reparations will be made today. In form of storytellings.
Indeed, indeed.
Hey, don't feel afraid of an undercover raid. There's no need to fuss. Ain't nobody spine like us. Spine like us.
So it's like the School of the Americas that we had here that we trained all the like South and Caribbean dictators in, and you know.
Wait, what? You had a school where you trained future dictators?
Yeah, I think it was called like the School of Americas. I think it was in like Georgia or something. We trained like Trujillo there, the guy that had the swimming pool full of sharks that he used to dump dissidents into. Papa, whatever his name was, in Haiti. Hold on, let me look it up. Literally
Papadopoulos
type it.
Valier. So were you deliberately training them to go off and be dictators, or is it just they happen to all go off and be dictators? So, for instance, in London, we have the London School of Economics, and the joke was that everyone who studied there post-war ended up going home and like becoming hardcore dictators in like African countries. But it wasn't like that the college was deliberately trying to make them do that.
Well, that's what happens when it's like privatization goes off after populism and communists. Okay, so Bina, to offshoot, the U.S. Army School of America's SOA was founded in 1946 and originally located at Fort Gulick in the Panama Canal Zone. The school was assigned the specific Cold War goal of teaching anti-communist counterinsurgency training to military personnel of Latin American countries.
Guys are nefarious as shit.
Yeah, it's actually now located in Fort Rucker, Alabama.
So it still exists.
Oh, and it was in Fort Jennings, Georgia, so I didn't lie. Look at that. All
So
that
you
shit I
can.
knew right
So
now.
how do you gain admission? Could I just say, hey, I want to do a postgraduate degree there and become a dictator? Please let me in. Because I would do that. I could see myself running a small African country. Heck, I could even run my own country.
would
They'll
it
be
be
looking
like-
for candidates soon.
Can we spitball some names like Bina Stan, or are we doing like...
The Democratic Republic of Bina.
I think so. Except the Republic of Bina would not be a democracy. I assure you.
Well, I mean,
Well,
the Democratic Republic of North
definitely.
Korea is still called the Democratic Republic of North Korea, and that's not democracy.
Democratic Republic of Congo. You
Yeah.
know?
I do want to have a machete on my flag.
That was you really want to strike fear into the hearts of your populace with your flag.
I
Machete
think
and a
so.
microphone.
And I also think I would have like an army that would have a lot of gold braid, like the inverse correlation between like the actual fighting capability of the army and how like fancy their uniforms are. Oh dear.
So I'm not really seeing. It just looks like you have to be like a big army guy in the Americas to attend. The School of the Americas has been blamed for human rights violations committed by its former students. It denies accusations of teaching torture. And they say that's absolutely false, and that the school should not be held accountable for the actions of its graduates.
I agree. I kind of want to go. Do they have like brochures, like when you apply to college and you download the brochure?
I don't know. It looks like it's been pretty much disbanded because, like people were like, hey, this is pretty fucked up. Let's see.
born in the wrong
The
time.
protest, they have the leader of the Norte Valley cartel in Colombia was a... Yeah, I mean,
It seems
there's-
that global dictators are much better educated. I mean, I just didn't realize that college graduation was a sort of essential feature of running, a cartel.
When you go to Harvard and they're like, look at all these graduates and the great things they've done. I feel like, you're in the company of the greatest minds ever. That's what that school can kind of boast for.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
You too can be like.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Some of the graduates they list on this Wikipedia page here. In Mexico, the Zetas cartel founder, Heriberto the executioner Lazcano, and Arturo Zeta Juan Guzman de Quena. So those are the guys that throw decapitated heads onto dance floors and hang bodies off of freeways and stuff like that. So they're good guys.
You can't fault them for creativity.
Happy days.
My dad is friends with a fellow named Peter Hudson, who is a fairly famous biologist in England. And I believe he is currently, but I'm not sure, but at least at one point, he was a scientific advisor to the royal. And he kind of got in with all of these high-end people in England because he was a grouse biologist, so he was helping all of the upland bird hunting estates recover their populations. And he ended up working a lot with a lot of the hunting dogs that the royal family uses, to the point where he's spent a lot of time with the royal family hunting. And he said one time, his first time hunting with them in the field, Elizabeth was there, and they were all out, and they had a picnic, and after the picnic was done, they had all these dishes, and he went to clean some of the dishes, and Elizabeth was picking up some of the dishes too, and he goes, "Oh no, you can't do that. I have to get the dishes for you. You know, you're the queen." And took the dishes from her, and all of her assistants and folks were like, "Oh no, don't do this. He's like, "Why?" And I guess Elizabeth enjoys cleaning dishes. That's like one of her
She's a scullery maid.
hobbies, is that she really, really legitimately enjoys doing the dishes after picnics. So they took all of his dishes and gave them to her.
Wow.